Welcome everybody to the final episode of Series 2 of the FPA's Assembly Point podcast. I'm Chris Miles, Commercial Director at the Fire Protection Association. Today I'm absolutely delighted I'm humbled to be in the company of a panel of guests who are renowned experts in fire safety. Starting with Adam Turk, CEO of Siderise Group, Dennis Davis, Executive Officer of the Fire Sector Federation, and Amanda Long, Chief Executive of the Considerate Constructors scheme, Building a Safer Future, and the Code for Construction Product Information, CCPI. To kick us off, last month the Fire Sector Federation launched a white paper on developing a national strategy for fire safety, and that will be the focus of our discussions today. Thank you all for joining me. So let's make a start then, and in doing so, I'll caveat that by saying that the discussion related to the strategy could very well be long-winded and take way more time than we've got today. We've only got 40 minutes or so, so please accept that we can't cover every eventuality, every topic in there, but we will try and attempt to cover some critical aspects and try and see how the strategy affects the fire safety industry and the construction sector in particular, and then how that influences government and the regulator. The white paper, the strategy document, seeks to create a holistic approach to effectively managing fire risk within buildings and achieving a sustainable and a safer society via a strategy, which we haven't had for some time. This document was launched at the fire conference just last month in October. Dennis, I know you were absolutely instrumental in bringing the document together. You did most of the legwork from what I remember. It says at the bottom it's an outcome, or it's been produced by the Fire Sector Federation Fire Strategy Board. So for the benefit of our listeners and viewers, could you just kind of explain the board and where it fits and what its remit is?
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, and thanks for the invitation to join the podcast. The Fire Safety Advisory Board existed a decade or so ago, and the Fire Strategy Group that now is working with this paper and has produced this paper, a broader group, replicates some of the thinking that was around then, which was incidentally about the same time as the Fire Sector Federation was formed. And they came into existence. One disappeared and the other came into existence, I should say, because really the government was reducing its scale, wanted industry and the fire and rescue service to do more of its own thing. Now, during the intervening period, one of the consequences that we feel has happened is that there's been a disconnect appearing along the way, very much between how fire safety policy in the UK is developed, how things like businesses like the building and construction sector has developed rapidly, and how fire safety overall has started to drift and literally become a little bit complacent, only to have the shock of the Grenfell Tower fire, which has now forced everyone to refocus again. What is very apparent in that process is that we've literally taken our eye off the ball and have lost sight of the fact that fire really needs to be a priority in everybody's agenda, needs to be up there, considered all the time, and that overall there needs to be a broad, holistic view taken across all sectors, not just the construction sectors, all sectors, that seeks to look at fire in the round. So that when we do things, we do take into account fire and its implications. Otherwise, our view is you will not have a resilient and a sustainable environment, full stop. That, of course, to us is fairly obvious because of what's happened in the tragedy that's happened. And what we don't want constantly is to face this process, which is how we've appeared to develop in the UK around fire and fire safety, which is have a tragedy, try and fix the problems of that tragedy, move forward one step. Only for a decade or so later, another tragedy occurs and we go around the same loop, trying to fill the same individual gaps, only for it to happen again. So we want to break that circle, and we want collectively policymakers, the industries involved, and primarily here we're talking the built environment, so construction and building sectors and the fire sectors, to come together to try and look at this thing in a much more strategic way. And to do that, you need a strategy. This paper effectively calls for those groups to both consider the issues and to think about forming a strategy where collectively we can all work together to make the thing much better. And that primarily means having a good solid awareness of each other and what we're doing and how we're trying to move forward, always trying to place fire somewhere in the agenda so that it's at least considered. So when a new innovative program happens in the building industry, people do say, would this affect fire? Does this affect fire? How might this affect fire? So at least we integrate it, not to stop things happening, but to actually ensure that what we do moves forward, but move forward in a safe, consistent way. And I think that's the debate, that's the discussion that we're trying to have. Create this awareness, try and get people to think about fire together, and try and think about it holistically, because these discussions have been going on within the fire sector for years. The problem is we're talking too much to ourselves, and this board has been formed deliberately so it isn't just fire sector related. It looks to people from outside industries who are directly impacted and do directly impact the fire safety of people. And that's really the purpose of the discussion paper. And hopefully the coming together maybe early next year of a firm, a strategy group that will make this work.
So to be clear, thanks, Dennis. So to be clear, this is about developing a strategy. It isn't a strategy in itself. And to kind of emphasise Dennis's points, there's been a lack of thought about fire safety over the past decades, probably, and we've got complacent. Now this document's out there saying, "Hey guys, don't get complacent. Let's think about this properly." And develop something a bit more concrete. No pun intended. So the drivers behind the creation of the document are now perhaps very understandable, and perhaps it's been obvious to some of us for a while that this was needed. I think if we can turn to Adam, what I'd like to expand on, if I may, Adam, about is where the proposed strategy fits into the overall landscape of fire safety in the construction sector, given your involvement from the construction side, perhaps more so than the fire side, or perhaps both, but certainly you have a good handle on the construction sector and how this proposal will be accepted by them.
Thanks, Chris. No, it's a really good set of questions there that you've raised. I think the first thing that we've got to understand is that the construction industry generally is a very, very fragmented industry. We have a wide-ranging number of organisations, many of them small, medium-sized companies, SMEs. And as a result of that, we end up with lots of different associations and organisations, lots of different views and comments, all filtering their way through. And by the time those views get to government, there isn't a lot of mass in those voices and those sounds. And the idea of pulling everything together and saying we need a singular voice, we need to pull together all the initiatives, all the ideas, all the creativity, all the drivers for change, and we need to create a singular voice to be able to sit with government and talk about the things that need to happen. I think that for me was the most important thing behind the white paper, was about creating a singular voice through the Fire Sector Federation of those things that need to happen, and recognising, I think, at the same time that government doesn't have the expertise in fire that maybe it had many, many years ago, and therefore it needs industry to help and advise it. But if that advice, those thoughts are not coming through in any volume, they're coming through in a fragmented way, then government hasn't been listening, and that's something that we absolutely need to change. In terms of how industry will take that on board, obviously there'll always be pockets of the industry that want to keep their own kind of this was ours, but for me that's wrong. We've got some really key fundamental issues, and we need to work together to create the solutions. And we don't need VHS versus Betamax. We need to agree what is the right solution, and we need to work with that solution. And so I'm hopeful that the industry will recognise that there is a group through which all of their suggestions, ideas, requirements for change, considerations can come through, get the mass and the volume of the industry behind it, and then we can actually get some real change.
I think we'll come on to government in a minute. You talked about their awareness or their knowledge or their competence perhaps in these subjects. So we will come on to those, Adam. So thanks for that. I wonder if I can maybe throw a bit of a curveball at you and wonder if you've got some thoughts on what other critical aspects we needed. I know you've been fundamentally involved in the CCPI. Maybe it's you could just explain how that would support such a strategy.
Yeah, look, I think there are three areas really. There's the area of regulation, and then there's my two soapboxes, if you like, which is the area of competence generally, and the area about information, and particularly product information. And the Code for Construction Product Information was established to reinstill trust in those people that use information about products, that it can be trusted as being accurate, up-to-date, clear, accessible, and unambiguous. And the Code for Construction Product Information has been introduced to create a level playing field at a higher standard for product manufacturers to raise their game and create information that the people using it can trust. And I think that's absolutely key. I would say over and over and over again, the two challenges go hand in hand. There is no point creating a really competent individual and giving them data that they can't trust. There is equally no point in creating phenomenal data that can be trusted and relied upon and handing it to somebody who's not competent to use it. And so it's absolutely fundamental that those two aspects go hand in hand.
So it's interesting you talk about your two soapboxes. I thought you had a lot more than two soapboxes, but we'll go with two for now. Maybe Dennis, if you'd allow Dennis to step up onto the competency soapbox for a minute. I know you've been heavily involved in that, Dennis. You want to say a word on how that plays into the strategy?
Yeah, very much so. I think what Adam was saying about SME and regulation and so on is so critical to all this and products, product components and systems. And I see it all the while. And one of the big areas, anecdotally talking to colleagues in the Federation, is around this competency thing, where all those things play together. So what's the point of having a component or a product that doesn't fit into a system it was never intended to fit in? And if you're competent, you realise that instantly and you don't do it. You cross-check it. And if you can track the information source back, because the product has been well tested and well marketed and comes with the correct information and serials, you can track that back. But equally, from my side of it, I look at the fire risk assessors who go into these buildings and the fire engineers who are involved in some of the design criteria. It is a fact that when the legislation emerged really around fire risk assessment, it was deliberately brought into being on the basis that individuals could carry out their own fire risk assessment. They didn't have to hire anyone to do it. It was deliberately done that way so that there wouldn't be, as the government of the time called it, a consultant's charter. Fast forward that to the tragedy of Granville, and what do you see straight away? You see calls. How could you possibly end up in a situation like this? So a lot of the competency issues around fire risk assessment, for example, we've spent a great deal of time as a federation building up now what we think is quite a credible way forward of third-party certification. Individuals on registers, people who can actually demonstrate that they are competent in these tasks, codes of practice that will support that, and advice to individuals to how to choose the right sort of fire risk assessor and listing these people nationally so that people can go into it and find them and use them. But when we look at what we have constructed as an industry, it comes back to this point Adam was making. It's quite small, quite discreet. And the difficulty then is that when you're confronting something like the number of buildings that now have to have their external walls at least looked at as part of a fire risk assessment, you find you've got a capacity problem. So you've got capacity and capability issues that are in abundance. So industry has been working very, very hard. At the fire conference, when this strategy document was released, we were able to put a slide on, which came from across industry, from the CIC group, the industry response group, that showed how all the different professional sectors have been working now at this for 5 years to try and improve the standard of the individual competencies that have to be done. But there are loads and loads of people in the SME sectors, particularly, who are not even aware, I suspect, of some of the challenges that are now coming down through the new regulations, the secondary legislation that will follow the Building Safety Act, for example. And it is very much about trying to reach those people and embed within them a cultural base that understands that competency isn't just a tick box, and it isn't just a certificate that you got for qualifying at something. It's something that lives and breathes, and you have to be part of it. You have to continuously stay up to speed, and you have to behave in a certain way. And I think industry's part of the white paper is very much about trying to get some of those messages over. So we're looking at competency, and we're looking at things like modular and mass timber constructions, all part of that process, alongside innovation, because innovation and the inevitable time lag that exists between a product actually coming into use and the standards and controls that really affect it being put into place will exist going forward, because this industry, the building and construction sector particular, are some of the most innovative industries, creative industries that we've got. So you're always going to be in a situation where regulation will lag behind where the industry itself is progressing. So it's critical to me.
Thank you, Dennis. And we talked about government, and one of the key messages from the paper is ensuring that fire safety, and you mentioned it, Dennis, remains high on their agenda, and it's fundamental to their thoughts in delivering regulations and requiring those operating in the construction sector, if not other areas, to make sure they don't get complacent and bear fire safety in mind. At the fire conference in October, the new chairman of the all-party parliamentary fire safety and rescue group, Bob Blackman, seemed very enthusiastic, really engaged in this, in fire safety in general, but also in the development of a strategy. So Bob seemed to be engaged. I'm sure his enthusiasm will rub off to the all-party parliamentary group. What more do we need to do to get government engaged, bearing in mind, I think it's still a stated aim of them not to heavily regulate for lots of things. And okay, they've put the regulator in place, but I kind of think that's it now. They might just say, well, we've done our bit. Now it's up to you, the fire industry, you, the construction industry, to go on and sort it out.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. I mean, the parliamentarians, and as you say, Bob Blackman and the group that specifically looks at fire is a good example, are on board. I don't doubt that for a moment. If you look at some of the transcripts of the legislation, the Building Safety Act, the Fire Safety Act, when it was all going through, you can sense that in Parliament, the parliamentarians, as I say, are very much aware of this and want it right and want it done properly, and they don't want these gaps opening up again. But of course, the executive, the government, is the party where it happens to a large extent. And yes, one of the good things that's come out of all this tragedy is the fact that we now have an agency, all right, the Health and Safety Executive, with this new role, with the Building Safety Regulator. And I think how that grows and how that develops becomes quite crucial. I go back to Adam's point about SME, particularly in this area, and the same applies, I have to say, in the fire sector. In a lot of industries in the fire sector, they are SMEs. In fact, in fire risk assessment and engineering, a lot of them are lone traders. So, you know, the context here is a lot of small things. And when you think of building, Amanda's point, okay, we can all think of the Shard. We can all think of the multi-million-pound developments in London and Manchester, wherever. But most building is relatively modest and small. A great deal of it now is deregulated from planning, and you can do it at home, do all this sort of stuff. And a lot of it occurs in relatively low rise, and a great deal of it now, particularly, occurs in adaptation, changing the use of buildings. As our cities change, the centres, buildings that were retail become residential, and so on and so forth. The picture I'm trying to paint is that this is a vast moving field, and that really, although we seem to have captured the idea of stopping catastrophe, which is really the major hazards type approach, which HSE is perfectly endowed to do, the vast majority of this industry, the point I'm trying to make, is out there in relatively small pieces, and it drives home both Adam and Amanda's points. If you haven't got a culture, if you haven't got competency across the piece, then all these little problems might start to occur. I mean, we are very, very well aware of how buildings, modern buildings, can disappear quite quickly in fire. Not because they're badly constructed, but they're constructed in ways that allow transmission of fire because they are moving that fast in terms of innovation. Now, we want fast build homes like everybody does. The country's desperate for them. We will want them built safely. So you ask the question, how do we do this? My argument is we go to the executive, the government, we convince the policymakers, i.e. the ministers responsible for these departments, and we've now got two looking after fire safety in the built environment, whereas we had one. Lord Greenhow was spread eagle between GWLUC and the Home Office. Now we've got two separate ministers again. There's a risk of something falling in the gap. Underneath them, we've got obviously the civil service, and the thing that emerged to us was the loss of expertise in the civil service over the past decade. And beneath that process is all the regulatory and control and regime systems that exist. And our view is very straightforward. We need to get the expertise into that group of people. And we also need to get regime processes like culture and like this ability to look at innovation and modern methods, as people call them, although they're conventional methods now. It's how we build most things at the moment. We need to get these things looked at in a much more detailed way so that we change the way we look at the whole process. We actually have a viewpoint that says, yes, we're going to use these things because they're sustainable, but some of it is not very resilient to fire. We need to make it so it is resilient to fire, it is safe, and then we can just plough on faster and faster, building more and more homes. So it is about reaching those people as much as it is about reaching the parliamentarians. I think the parliamentarians will reinforce the view, but they expect people in government to do their bit, and they expect people in industry like us to do our bit.
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, I mean, the culture change we've spoken about is from the very top all the way through. I do kind of worry that the focus is on high-rise residential buildings, and we forget the smaller ones, which you talked about. Of course, the risk is less with those, but we can't ignore them, and I wouldn't want us to ignore them. If I could just move us on very unseamlessly to the strategy document, trying to address the sustainability agenda, and that's obviously a big driver in construction. Dennis touched on it before with modular buildings, with massive timber buildings. Adam, I'm conscious, and it was a theme of the fire conference. I'm conscious that governments, as we just said, unlikely to regulate heavily for fire safety. We'll continue probably to see a deregulation agenda. How will the construction sector take that responsibility and put in a system, particularly for modern methods of buildings, put in a system that ensures fire safety is a good enough consideration with these new builds? And I've heard so many times that modular building in particular, but not just, creates cavities which are then easy to be exploited by by fire, and I know that's kind of close to your heart, obviously, from where you come from.
Yeah.
What do we need to do to make sure those things don't get overlooked?
Industry can create its own pull, that clients, main contractors can demand that things are done properly. They can demand that people working on their sites demonstrate competence. They can demand that people designing use information that is trusted. And you can create that pull. I know the number of major contractors are getting ready to say that by date X, they will only use in their supply chain manufacturers that are CCPI verified. The industry can take responsibility for itself. And that was Dame Judith Hackett's point right at the start. It's not for government to legislate for the industry. It's about industry to sort itself out. But what we're doing is creating the tools and the agenda that allow those people to create the pull and demand that they get better. And I guess then that does lead us on to volumetric, because I am concerned that in volumetric, which I fully support, I've always said, dare I say this too publicly, but I've always said you wouldn't buy a brand new car that was assembled in a muddy field on a rainy day. So why do you buy a building that is? And I think this is volumetric, this idea about factory manufacture, where you've got good quality control, good management of materials, you work in dry environment, you've got good control of the labour and the competency and the standard, is all fantastic. But in building volumetric, we are setting up a set of voids within a building that I'm not sure we've properly assessed from a perspective of fire. I'm not sure we've properly analysed what happens if fire gets into the void, and how do we stop fire, and equally importantly, smoke from travelling through the building. Remember, smoke's the killer, not fire. You speak to some people who talk about there being no combustibility within the void, which I disagree with. You've got wires, pipes, etc. But you've also got to stop smoke spreading, and we've got to work out how we do that. And we've not tested that, and I think that's an area that the industry's got to get its hands around and do something proper from a fire safety perspective. I go back to the old Cardington days of timber frame, when we built that fantastic 6-storey timber frame building in Cardington, 20 years ago, and we blew it up and set fire to it and did all sorts of stuff, and we learned how that building would respond in different situations. I think the same needs to be done with volumetric.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I'm not sure I got an answer that says, here's what we have to do. I see the drive from the tier ones. I see that coming. I think there's ulterior motives with some of that, i.e. they've been caught out a little bit, so they're now making sure they don't get caught out again, and that's fantastic. I don't care how it happens as long as it happens. But I want to make sure we've got something in place that ensures fire safety in these volumetric modular buildings. And I don't know that I've heard an answer yet that says, here's how we're going to do it. And I know it's not easy, but I want an answer. I want somebody to say, this is what we're doing. Dennis, you've got a program in the Fire Sector Federation running to address that. So maybe that's a route forward. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Yeah, but we've got to look at it, Chris. And as Adam was saying, I mean, industrialised buildings should be better. I mean, the conditions they're being built in is a much more controlled environment. I mean, I also look forward to the day when we bring technology into some of this. I mean, even in constructed buildings, the ability to find a volume, a cavity, and see how big that volume is, shouldn't be beyond us through science and technical tools. But it is at the moment, so you should be able to inspect a building and check out a building to see just how big the cavity spreads are and all the rest of it. Really, the only thing that the government can help you with a great deal in this, apart from big lumps of money if you want that, but really is legislative programs. And they've done that. But when you look at the whole, the setting of standards, the sort of research into innovations, the production of exemplars, the tier ones and all the rest can follow, the expectations and investments that are needed. When you look at all the list of the parts of this band that you're trying to orchestrate, most of them belong to industry. They're nothing to do with government. We can set industry standards. We can do industry research. We can build exemplars and get good clients. We can protect workforces so that somebody can call out a failure and not be pushed down a path because, it's their job and it's Friday afternoon and the contractor wants the job done and all that. We can make some investments in people, time, research, testing and so on. And we can lay out the expectations of our sectors to say this is what we really want out of this. Now, all of that doesn't need a government, but it does need, coming back to where both of the others have spoken and myself, it does need a central, singular voice with a strategy that says, this is how we're going to play this game. That's what this is about.
You're asking for an orchestra with a conductor, with somebody to lead that orchestra.
And that's the strategy. That's the strategy.
Yep. Agreed. I'm a bit worried we're playing dissonant jazz at the minute without a band leader.
It's time culturally to stop cutting corners and do it properly. The tools are starting to exist to help people to do that. Business leaders have got to take responsibility for making sure our buildings are safe.
Great final word. Thank you. So, Dennis, Adam, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating, as I thought it would be, fascinating discussion, and I really very much value your contributions. For the next part of the episode, I'm very pleased to welcome another guest, Amanda Long, who is Chief Executive of the Considerate Constructors scheme, Building a Safer Future, and the Code for Construction Product Information. Amanda, as you know, the Fire Sector Federation launched a white paper on developing a national strategy for fire safety last month at the Fire Conference in London, and we're focusing on that in our discussion today. I've already spoken to Adam and Dennis about them and reinforced that we can't be expected to cover all of the issues raised by the white paper, but go through some of the key important aspects. So, Amanda, presumably the proposed strategy coming from the white paper is just the start. From your perspective, then, what do you see as the other essential aspects that are critical to getting this right and putting in a structure that we can be confident with?
Well, thanks very much for the question, Chris. Now, as my colleagues on this have sort of started to say, it is about joining up the dots and filling the gaps. That's absolutely key. So some of the immediate actions that have been sort of brought forward through the strategy, continuing to work on raising standards within competency, looking at understanding and taking direct action towards improving, the use of some of the off-site modular buildings and managing the risk within those, so that there's support for that new homes agenda. Looking at some of the risk around mass timber buildings and understanding that better, and then also staying on top of innovation in construction and whether that's materials, whether or not it's practices, methodologies. There is a lot of change in innovation, and trying to stay on top of that from a fire safety perspective are all going to be sort of key as immediate actions. But absolutely essential across all of it is we can focus on those things, but if we haven't got a leadership and cultural approach right the way across the built environment sector that is putting fire safety, building safety first, if that's not happening, if that culture isn't in place, then all of this other work we're doing doesn't have the framework to sit in that it needs to be able to go forward and ultimately deliver on a sustainable, safe environment to live and function in. So it really is looking for that leadership and culture piece. As you mentioned in the introduction, Chris, I am responsible for the Building a Safer Future Charter and also the Code for Construction Product Information. And both of those schemes really are about creating an ecosystem that supports that cultural change that's needed right the way across the built environment sector. And when that's put in place, then we start to reduce risk and sort of dial down some of the behaviours that are out there that sit behind the concerns in relation to fire safety risk and building safety risk.
Thanks, Amanda. It's interesting you talk about cultural change, and it does feature in the paper to ensure that's encapsulated in a proposed strategy, driving that cultural improvement across the construction industry. Actually, cultural change across any industry is difficult. I think it requires the building safety regulator to stimulate policy from the client's boardroom to the on-site workforce. Cultural change is really difficult to do. I don't know if we can drive it from the top down. It needs probably to come from inside the industry. So from your perspective, it obviously needs a lot of things to happen. What do you think is the one key change that we could do to start that cultural change that we'd all like to see? Maybe just drill down to one thing rather than try and change the whole culture in one sentence, so to speak.
Well, Chris, just sort of rowing back on that just a little bit. You would expect the sort of one change, to come from, ultimately the morality, the moral argument that this is that putting building safety, fire safety first from a leadership and a culture perspective in any organisation is absolutely the right thing to do. That would be, I'm sure, your expectation, my expectation, and the expectation of many across the industry. But the reality is that that isn't necessarily going to be what drives new behaviours. We'll see, as you say, the regulator make some difference. The new regulation come in. I would expect that framework to, in its way, as a regulator, seek to drive behaviours. But there are other ways to drive new behaviours and bring in culture change. Market incentives, market mechanisms are some of those. So the advantage and hopefully the benefit that tools such as the Code for Construction Product Information or Building a Safer Future can bring to this is are ways that organisations can differentiate themselves, can show themselves to be going through these processes of putting fire safety, building safety first, and can prove that they're doing that through these independently verified processes, and also learn through those processes. And you're right. Culture change isn't easy, and it isn't going to happen overnight. And there's a lot to learn. When we set up Building a Safer Future, we looked to other industries that all deal with managing major hazard safety, and oil and gas, chemicals, aviation, nuclear, rail. There's all so much that they have learnt in order to help organisations in those industries make dealing with this kind of safety business as usual. The construction sector, the built environment sector, is very good at having made occupational health and safety business as usual. So the one change is we need to make fire safety, building safety, business as usual by putting it first from a leadership and a culture perspective. That's what we're really after. And the opportunity to learn from those other sectors and use the tools that we've created through Building a Safer Future and Code for Construction Product Information will really help the industry with that. So I think the key is look to the market incentives, look to the opportunity to differentiate yourselves as organisations. And there is the opportunity for push-pull here. There's the opportunity for within the industry, for clients, for contractors, for organisations that are working with their supply chain to look for companies that are using the tools that help them prove that they are they've got the leadership and culture in place, which is putting building safety and fire safety first.
That's fascinating, and actually, Amanda, I've been somewhat sceptical that we'll get the change that we wanted. It's taken 5 years to get where we are. But just over the last few months, perhaps 6 or so, I have seen a change. I have seen the direction, kind of culture beginning to change. I guess that's what it is. And I spent yesterday at the London Build Expo, and the way people were talking, listening to the presentations, I had to do a summary of the changes since Grenfell. And there were lots and lots and lots of things that government's been doing, that the industry's been doing, the code of practice, building a safer future, all that you've been doing. I do see it going in the right direction, despite my skepticism over the last years. It does seem to be going the right way.
Absolutely. I mean, skepticism is healthy. It's a healthy thing. It will help drive the conversation forward. But there are some amazing organisations and individuals in this sector who are really putting their hearts and minds into bringing in new culture, showing leadership within their organisations to reduce the risks that fire safety, that building safety represent. But it is a completely new landscape. In terms of really getting hold of it and putting it at the heart of everyone's thinking and behaviours, there's a lot to learn there. And I would urge anybody to engage with the Building Safer Future Charter, engage with the Code for Construction Product Information as we get that moving over the next few months, and ultimately use those tools to learn, to develop, and to create a leadership and a culture that really does put building safety, puts fire safety first.
I'm genuine. Thank you. I'm genuinely sorry we don't have more time to talk on this, and it's been absolutely fascinating. And I really wish we could talk longer. Before we wrap up, though, maybe one final major point from you, Amanda, and you're not allowed to say culture change in your answer.
That's not fair. I suppose my final point is, I think it's not about waiting for regulation anymore. I think it's not about waiting for the regulator to do something. We've seen the Fire Safety Act come in. We've seen the Building Safety Act come in. We know that the secondary legislation of the building safety to come through over the next few months. But actually, I think the onus is now on the industry really to start driving this whole agenda forward. And I can't give you an answer on this without saying it is about leadership and culture change. That is what we've got to deliver on. And if we can deliver on that, then we have the framework to be able to put in all the fantastic innovation, all of the other thinking that has been going on, Chris.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That was a little unfair. So
it was.
So thanks, Amanda. Thanks again. Thanks to everybody that's listened. For any of our listeners wishing to access the white paper that we've spoken about today, you can do so via the Fire Sector Federation's website at firesectorfederation, all one word, .co.uk. And sadly, that's a wrap for Series 2 of Assembly Point. I'm sure we'll be doing Series 3 in 2023, so watch this space. If there are any topics of discussion you like to hear about, or you want to participate and get your point across, please let us know. Either email myself or marketing@thefpa.co.uk. And thanks for listening. Have a great end of the year. Take care, everybody.